The bay mare stood on the boards of the Wickham Green auction ring, with her ears flat and her nostrils flared, and Clara Whitfield held the lead rein with both hands, so that no one in the crowd would see that one of them was shaking. The September sun had burned away the morning mist, and the air over the green smelled of crushed, wet grass and warm horse, and the sharp tar from a fresh-painted hurdle. Country gentlemen leaned on the rail, with their thumbs hooked into their waistcoats. Farmers from the chalk villages bent their heads together over folded papers. Above them, on the painted dais, where the auctioneer worked, a handbell rang once, and the bidding settled, like a hand smoothing a tablecloth. Clara had brought the bay mare here on a borrowed cart from Whitfield Cottage at 6 in the morning. The mare was called Juno. She had been her father's pride. She was the last thing in the world that the Whitfields owned outright, now, after the bailiffs and the lawyers, and the long, quiet months since the apoplexy had taken her father at his own breakfast table. Clara had walked into the auctioneer's room at first light and entered the mare as Lot 32, and signed the consignment slip with a hand that had not shaken then. She had been wearing her one good gown, indigo wool, plain at the throat, the gown her mother had made over twice. She had pinned a brass currycomb to the inside of her sleeve because she could not bear to leave it at the cottage, and because she meant, if she could, to send Juno away groomed. She had not expected the Viscount of Carraway to be in the front rank of the buyers. He came late, after the second round, in a coat the colour of pale tobacco with a brown velvet collar. His fair hair was cropped close at the nape, in the new fashion, and the line of his jaw caught the light from the south side of the green. He was beautiful. 27, perhaps, and beautiful the way certain knives are beautiful. Narrow, finely set, intended for one use. He raised his glove to the auctioneer in greeting, and the bidders nearest the rail straightened as a man, because Lord Edmund Carraway had bought up every loose Whitfield bill in the county over the last 3 months, and they all knew it. The auctioneer called Lot 32, and the bay mare was led forward, and a small, uneasy silence travelled through the rail. "That mare," said Carraway, loud enough to be heard the whole length of the ring, "I would not give a sovereign for on the open market." His mouth curved. "Nor for the woman selling her." He turned his head fractionally toward his companions, and they laughed, the small, obedient laugh of men who had been told what was funny in advance. "Whitfield bloodlines and Whitfield horseflesh. She's not worth a horse, the girl. Not worth the horse she has brought. Knock her down to the hounds, Mr. Bunce, and have done." The auctioneer's bell rang once, uncertain, into the silence after. Clara did not look at Carraway. She looked at the mare's left ear, and she felt, very precisely, the brass of the currycomb under the cloth of her sleeve. And she thought of her father saying, in the last spring of his life, that a horse will know whether the hand on its rein is afraid. She tightened her hand on the lead, and the mare's ear came up by a fraction of a degree. The crowd did not laugh with Carraway. The crowd had gone, the still, watching quiet of a country audience that has not yet decided whose side to take. "I will give you the whole of my stable for her." The new voice came from the north side of the ring, behind the dais, where a man had been standing with his back against a pillar and his hat in his hand, and Clara had not noticed him, because she had not been looking at any face but Juno's. He stepped forward now into the bar of bright sun under the awning, and the crowd parted for him in a clean line, without anyone moving very much. Mr. Bunce on the dais lowered his hammer onto the desk with a soft, surprised sound. "Your Grace," said Mr. Bunce. He was tall, a hand and a half taller than Carraway, and broad in the shoulder under the black morning coat he still wore for his cousin. The late Duke had been taken by a fever in March, and the new Duke was new enough that half the county had still not laid eyes on him. His hair was very dark, a little disordered, as if he had been riding. His eyes were the grey of slate after rain. There was a thin, pale scar running an inch under the left cheekbone, where a sabre had once gone in, and a regimental surgeon had pulled it out. He was, perhaps, 28 years old. "I beg your pardon, Mr. Bunce," said Adam, 5th Duke of Ravensmere, perfectly mild. "I have been silent some minutes. I should not be silent now." He inclined his head toward the dais and then turned and looked, for the first time, at Clara. "Miss Whitfield, forgive me. I think Lord Carraway's bid was not on offer. Mine is. I will give the whole of the Ravensmere stable, every horse standing in it this morning, for the bay mare you have brought. In stewardship to you, against my account, to be administered as you see fit, with the bay mare returned to her own stall. Mr. Bunce will write it." He paused. He did not smile. "Lord Carraway will not, I think, contest the price." The crowd made a single soft sound, the kind of sound a crowd makes when it has decided. "Your Grace," said Mr. Bunce again, after a beat, in the voice of a man whose ledger has just been required to do something it has not done in his lifetime. Yes, sir. I will write it." Adam turned his head a degree further and met Carraway's eyes across the rail. Carraway's beautiful mouth had gone perfectly flat. He stood with his glove still in his hand. He did not say anything for a long moment, and when he did, his voice was very pleasant. "A generous gesture, Ravensmere." "It was meant," said Adam, "as a correction." He turned then, and he did not look at Carraway again. He came across the green to the rail in 3 steps, and he took off his hat, and he addressed Clara at the height a man addresses a woman he means to treat as an equal. Not bending, not looking down. "Miss Whitfield, I have surprised you. I am sorry for it. May I walk you to the cart?" Clara's throat was full of the small steel taste of held-back fury and the metallic edge of relief, and underneath both of them, a flat astonishment that she could not yet put into words. She looked up into the slate-grey eyes of a man she had never seen before in her life, and she felt the brass of the currycomb shift against her wrist under the indigo wool, and she heard her own voice, level, surprising her. "I had not thought to be addressed by a duke this morning, Your Grace." "I had not thought to address one," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the smallest thing, not quite a smile. "I had thought to look at a brood mare. I was not informed of the consignment slip." "Then I am sorry to have been a consignment slip." "You were not," he said. "That is precisely my point." He offered his arm. After a long moment, Clara took it. The currycomb slipped a 1/4 inch inside her sleeve and pressed cold against her wrist. They walked the length of the green together, past the silent rail, past Mr. Bunce, already writing on a fresh sheet, past Lord Edmund Carraway, who watched them go without speaking, his glove still in his hand. At the gate, Clara stopped. She did not look at him. She looked at Juno, whose lead rein was now in the careful hand of one of Ravensmere's grooms, and she made her voice quiet, and she made it clear. "Your Grace, I will need to know what you have done." "Yes," said Adam. "I will come this afternoon and explain it. May I?" "Yes." 3 o'clock? 3. He inclined his head, returned his hat to his hair, and walked back along the rail toward Mr. Bunce. Clara stood at the gate with the empty space where the bay mare had been, and she felt, very precisely, the moment her hand stopped shaking. The brass of the currycomb was warm now from the heat of her wrist. She drew a breath. She turned away from the green, and she walked the half-mile back along the Wickham Lane to the borrowed cart without crying, because if she had cried in front of any of them, she would never have forgiven herself for it. That afternoon, at 3 minutes to 3, the gravel of the cottage drive sounded under hooves. Clara stood at the drawing-room window, with her hands quiet at her waist, and watched a single horseman come up the drive in the 4 o'clock light, and she counted the windows of the cottage to steady herself. There were 9. Mrs. Whitfield was in the kitchen. The 2 younger girls, Jane, who was 12, and Sophie, who was 8, had been sent to the orchard with a basket and strict orders not to come back until they were called. Clara had washed her face in cold water and tied a fresh white kerchief at her throat over the indigo wool. She had taken the brass currycomb out of her sleeve and laid it on the writing table by the window, where she could see it without having to look for it. The cottage smelled of beeswax and apples. The hall clock ticked. The horseman dismounted, gave his reins to a groom who had ridden up behind him, took off his hat, and knocked at the cottage door with the back of his glove. "Your Grace," said Clara, when she opened the door. "Please come in. My mother is in the kitchen and will be with us in a moment. May I take your hat?" "Thank you, Miss Whitfield." He stepped into the small hall and seemed instantly to take up most of it, broad-shouldered in the black coat, his hair still disordered from riding. He surrendered the hat. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, while she set the hat on the side table, and turned and led him into the drawing room. And Clara was conscious, walking ahead of him, of the 4 feet of muddy gravel between his boots and the rug, and of the fact that she did not know what to do with him. He was a duke. She had never had a duke in this room. She had had 2 solicitors in this room, and the bailiff once, and the doctor twice, and the rector every Sunday for 6 weeks. But she had never had a duke. "Please," she said, indicating the wing chair by the cold grate. "Sit, if you will." "Thank you." He sat. The wing chair was too small for him. He arranged himself in it without remark, and laid his gloves across his knee, and looked at her, with the same slate-grey directness she had received over the auction rail that morning. The window was at his back. The afternoon light fell on the brass of the currycomb on the writing table where she had set it. He did not glance at it. "Miss Whitfield, I will be brief, because brevity is the only courtesy I can pay you this afternoon. I have done a thing today which, by tomorrow morning, will be the most talked-about thing in 3 counties, and I have done it without consulting you, and I have done it in the public ring at Wickham, and you will be the one to bear the consequences of it, whether or not you would have chosen them. I owe you the explanation I promised. May I give it?" "Yes." He set his gloves down on his knee and joined his hands. He had soldier's hands, broad across the back, the nails clean, a knot of old scar tissue along the side of the left thumb, where a rain had once cut through the leather of a glove. "My cousin Henry, the 4th Duke," he said, "was taken in March by a marsh fever caught in Norfolk. I was on half pay in Brussels. The title fell on me in the 3rd week of April. I've been at Ravensmere 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, I have spent a quarter of my time on ledgers and 3/4 on horses, because horses are what I understand. The Ravensmere stable, when I arrived, was a disgrace. Half the boxes were empty. Of the horses standing, 3 were lame, 2 were old enough to be retired honourably, and the rest had been neglected by an understeward who has since left my service. I have written to 4 breeders in 3 counties asking for a manager. I have had 4 refusals. The reason, I will be plain, is that Lord Carroway has put it about that the Ravensmere stable is not worth managing, and that any man of horse who comes to me will lose his reputation in the doing of it." "I see," said Clara. "This morning," he said, "I came to Wickham to look at 3 horses I'd been told were going under the hammer. I came in plain clothes because I have a horror of being announced, and because I had not meant to bid in person. I had not heard you were on the slip. I had not heard your father's name. When Lord Carroway spoke as he did at the rail, I was already standing under the pillar. I was already decided. I would have offered for the bay mare in any case. After what he said, I offered with what I had to offer. I am sorry it was theatre. It was not, primarily, theatre." "What was it, primarily, Your Grace?" He looked at her. The afternoon light was very clear on his face. The scar under the cheekbone was a thin, pale line, a 1/4 inch long. "It was a correction," he said. "I was an officer for 9 years. There are certain things one does not let a man say in front of a woman in a public place. It is, perhaps you will think it old-fashioned. I do not, in any case, regret it." He paused. "I do regret the form of it. I should have given the answer privately afterwards. I should not have answered him in your name. I answered him in your name, and that was an error. I am sorry." "You gave me the whole of your stable." "I did." "In stewardship?" "In stewardship. The mare returns to your cottage as your property, against my account at Mr. Bunce's office. The remainder, every horse standing in the Ravensmere boxes this morning, the boxes themselves, the home paddock, the pasture, I have placed under your stewardship. The papers are with my man of business, and will reach you by post tomorrow. The stewardship is real, not honorary. I would like you to come up to Ravensmere and tell me which horses are worth keeping, which to sell, and which to send for to replace them. Because on the evidence of the way you stood at that rail this morning, you are the only person within 30 miles competent to do it without flinching. The figure I think the post is worth is at the bottom of the second sheet. Clara was silent for a long minute. The hall clock ticked. Your Grace? Miss Whitfield. I do not know whether what you have done is a kindness or a public humiliation worse than the one Lord Carroway intended. Nor do I, he said quietly. For certain. I think it is a kindness. I am not, however, in a position to tell you what you ought to think of it. That is for you to decide. He paused. He met her eyes. I would like to add one thing. The post would have been offered to you on identical terms if Lord Carroway had not spoken at the rail this morning. I had heard your father's name from old Major Pelham, who served with him in the peninsula. I had heard the name Whitfield as the man who could mend a horse and a ledger in the same afternoon. After my cousin was laid in the chapel, I asked Major Pelham whether the family was still in the country, and he told me they were. And he told me how. I was on my way to you when I stopped at Wickham. The offer was already in my pocket. Lord Carroway gave me the occasion of making it earlier than I had planned. He did not invent it. He paused. He looked, for the first time, at the brass currycomb on the writing table. He did not pick it up. That is the truth of it, he said. Whatever you decide, that is the truth of it. There was a step in the passage, and the door of the drawing-room opened, and Mrs. Whitfield came in with the tea tray held in two hands, and Adam rose to his feet with the easy quickness of a man who has spent 9 years standing up the second a woman enters a room. And Clara found that her own hands were folded very calmly at her waist, and that she was perfectly steady, and that something inside her was no longer steady at all. Your Grace, said Mrs. Whitfield. I am Anne Whitfield. Forgive me, the kettle was slow. Mrs. Whitfield, I am sorry to have come without warning. The fault is mine. He bowed. She set the tray down on the low table. She poured. The hall clock struck 4. Outside the east window, a wind moved the limes along the drive, and a single brown leaf turned over and over on the gravel until it lodged against the wheel of the Duke's saddle horse. And Clara watched it lodge there from the corner of her eye, while her mother asked the Duke whether he took sugar, and the Duke said that he did not, and the cup was poured, and the cup was handed across, and the world of the cottage that had been a quiet drowning place for 6 months tilted very slightly on its axis, and began, in the way of small worlds, to move again. Mrs. Whitfield drank her tea standing. She was thin under the black gown. 6 months in the same gown will thin any woman, and Anne Whitfield had been thin before her husband was laid in the chapel. Your Grace, she said, forgive me. I do not know what to say to you. Mrs. Whitfield, you do not have to say anything to me. I have come to discuss a matter of business with your daughter. I have presented her with terms. She is considering them. The decision is hers. I would like her to take a day to think. I would like her, if she wishes, to ride up to Ravensmere tomorrow afternoon and see the stable for herself before she gives an answer. May I send a horse for her at 1 o'clock? You may, said Mrs. Whitfield after a moment, and her hand on the rim of the tray relaxed. Thank you. I will not stay further. The afternoon is short. He set his cup down. He retrieved his gloves from the arm of the wing chair. He bowed first to Mrs. Whitfield, and then to Clara, and the bow to Clara was perceptibly the lower of the two, and Clara felt the small, unpracticed shock of having been bowed to in her father's drawing-room by a man who had not been required by birth to bow to her at all. She walked him to the door. In the hall she handed him his hat. At the threshold he paused. Miss Whitfield, one thing more only. The mare, the bay. I will send a man up tomorrow with her. He will leave her in your paddock and ride away. You are not, by accepting her, obliged to me on any other matter. The mare is yours. The stewardship is a separate question. Your Grace. Yes. You are a great deal of trouble, Your Grace. I am told so, he said, by my own man of business twice a week. The dry corner of his mouth happened again. He inclined his head. He stepped out into the gravel and put his hat on and crossed to the horse the groom was holding. He mounted. The groom mounted his own animal. The two riders turned the horses on the gravel and went down the drive between the pollarded limes at an easy walk. And Clara stood in the open doorway, with her hand still on the latch, and watched them out of sight. And the afternoon was very warm and very gold, and the brass of the currycomb on the writing table behind her caught one bar of late sun where it lay. "Clara," said Mrs. Whitfield, from inside the drawing-room. "Yes, Mamma." "What did he say to you?" "He said," said Clara, "that he is offering me a post." "What kind of post?" "Stewardship of his stable." Mrs. Whitfield set the empty cup on the tray with a small, precise sound. "And what," she said, "did Lord Carroway do this morning?" Clara closed the cottage door. The latch fell with a click. She turned in the small hall and faced her mother across the threshold of the drawing-room. "He stood at the rail," she said, "and he told Mr. Bunce I was not worth a horse. The Duke heard him. The Duke offered the whole of his stable for our mare. The whole green heard it. By tomorrow morning the whole county will have heard it. The mare comes back here in the morning. I am to ride up to Ravensmere tomorrow afternoon and see the stable, and decide whether to take the post or refuse it." Mrs. Whitfield put both hands flat on the back of the wing chair. "Take it," she said. "Mamma." "Take it, Clara." "I have not decided." "You will decide that you will take it because you cannot afford not to. Carroway has been buying our paper. He bought another £40 of it on Monday from Hatchard's man. He will come for this cottage by November. You have until November to find a position that pays. The Duke has offered you one. Take it." She paused. Her face was perfectly calm. "And Clara." "Yes, Mamma." "Do not, in God's name, fall in love with him." "I will not, Mamma." "You will," said Mrs. Whitfield. "If he is anything at all like the man he appeared to me this afternoon. I am telling you not to. I am telling you to take the post, and earn what he is paying you, and pay our paper out from under Carroway, and bring this family back inside its own walls, and not, under any circumstance, fall in love with a duke, whose own house has not yet decided what to do with him. He has not had the title 4 months. The matchmaking mothers of this country will eat him by Christmas. Do you understand me?" "I understand you, Mamma." "Promise me." "Mamma, I cannot promise." "Promise me," said Mrs. Whitfield, "that you will not let yourself believe what you are not entitled to believe." "I promise you that, Mamma." "Then take the post." Clara crossed the drawing-room to the writing table and laid her hand briefly on the cold brass of the currycomb. The metal was warm where the sun had been on it, and cold underneath, and the cold ran up under her fingernail and into the bone of her wrist, and she withdrew her hand. "I will take the post," she said. "Good," said Mrs. Whitfield, and she lifted the tray and carried it out of the drawing-room toward the kitchen, and Clara heard her crying perfectly quietly in the passage before she reached the kitchen door. And Clara did not go after her, because there are kinds of crying that a daughter does not interrupt. She stood in the drawing-room. The hall clock ticked. The afternoon shifted by another quarter hour. Out beyond the east window, the wind moved in the pollarded limes, and a single brown leaf turned over and over on the gravel, and stopped where the Duke's horse had stood. And the leaf stayed there in the slight depression the hoof had made, and Clara looked at it for a long time before she went up the narrow stair to her own room to change the indigo gown for the muslin she wore to weed the kitchen garden. It was, after all, only the work of a Wednesday afternoon. The post arrived at 9:30 the following morning. Mrs. Whitfield brought the heavy double sheet of paper into the kitchen on the corner of her apron and laid it on the deal table by the bread. And Clara dried her hands on the towel and broke the seal with her thumb. The seal was the Ravensmere falcon in red wax. The terms were as Adam had described them. The figure at the foot of the second sheet was 80 guineas a year, which was nearly twice what Clara had earned at her father's elbow in his last good year, when she had kept his books for him and taken his place at the Whitfield rent day in the autumn of 1813. She read it twice. She folded the papers. She set them on the dresser, under the salt cellar, where they could not blow away. 80 guineas, said Mrs. Whitfield. 80 guineas. It is too much. It is not too much, said Clara. It is the right post, at the right wage. He has written here that the understeward in the late Duke's time had 90, and he was a thief. You will not be a thief. I will not. At 1 o'clock, the Ravensmere groom turned in at the cottage gate, leading a steady, broad-chested grey gelding for Clara to ride. And at 5 minutes past 1, Clara was mounted in her father's old riding habit, let out twice at the shoulder, taken in once at the waist. The habit was deep indigo and dark with use. And at 10 minutes past 1, she rode down the lane of pollarded limes with the groom a horse's length behind her, and she did not look back, because Sophie was at the upstairs window, and Sophie did not need to see her sister look back. The lane went south through Burkham and Lower Tare, turned east at the footbridge over the Wickham Brook, and climbed up the South Down. The wind brought the smell of late summer and old hawthorn. They came over the brow at 2:30, and Ravensmere Park lay below in its valley, the deer scattered under the oaks, and the south front of the house catching the sun. The stable block lay east of the house, behind a yew hedge. The clock on the tower said 2:45. The groom led Clara around the east drive and into the cobbled court, and Adam came out of the stable arch in his shirt-sleeves, with the cuffs turned back and a tally-book in one hand, and he stopped on the cobbles when he saw her, and he closed the tally-book. Miss Whitfield, you are punctual. Your Grace? Will you come into the stable, or shall I have a chair brought? I will come into the stable, Your Grace. Good, he said. He set the tally-book on a window ledge of the arch, and came forward, and put his hand under the gelding's bridle to steady the horse for her dismount, and Clara swung down without using the mounting block, and her boots came onto the cobbles in a clean, small sound, and she straightened her habit at the waist with both hands. He stood back. He did not offer her his arm. He was, she noticed, careful not to offer her his arm. This way, he said. He led her under the arch into the stable court, a square paved with old red cobble, 12 loose boxes on 3 sides, harness and tack rooms on the 4th. You have been working, she said. I have been making a beginning. I did not want to bring you up here to look at the disgrace I inherited. I have spent the last 6 weeks getting the courts swept and the boxes oiled. The horses inside the boxes are another matter. Show me the horses, Your Grace. He showed her the horses, going methodically along the line of boxes and naming what was inside. There were 9 horses in 12 boxes, a black gelding with a wind-puffed hock, a grey mare with a clean leg and a sour eye. There was a brown gelding that had been ridden hard by the late Duke's nephew in May, and had not been right since. There was the bay mare, Juno, already returned, already standing at her old hay net in the 3rd box, with her ears forward and her head down. Clara stopped at Juno's door. She did not go in. She let the mare come to her. Juno came. She put her broad, warm muzzle into Clara's hand and breathed out. Clara stood with her hand under the muzzle for 1 long minute. She did not say anything. Behind her, the Duke had stepped back 2 paces and was looking very politely at the cobbles. When she turned to him, her eyes were clear. I would like to look at the brown geldings near hind, Your Grace, if I may. Yes. He brought the brown gelding out into the court. Clara crouched and ran her hand from hock to fetlock and pressed at the suspensory, and the brown gelding picked his foot up at the wrong moment and put it down again at the right one. And Clara nodded once, and stood up and brushed the straw from her habit at the knee. The suspensory is sprained. He has been worked on it. It will mend if he is rested 3 months. Do you have a paddock with shelter? I have 4. He goes into the warmest of the 4. He has no shoes on the hind. He should have a leather pad on the 4 until the suspensory is rested. I will write you a feed. Thank you. The grey mare? My cousin's wife rode her 4 years. She has not been ridden since November. Sell her. She has a sour eye. She will turn over in front of a child. Do you keep children at Ravensmere? I have 2 nieces who come at Christmas. Sell her. Yes. The black gelding? My cousin's. He was 8 last spring. The hock has been wind-puffed since the May meet. Cold water bandages morning and night for a fortnight. Then turn him out into the same warm paddock as the brown. He will be rideable in November. He is a sweet horse. Keep him. Yes. They went the length of the line. Miss Whitfield. Your Grace. You will take the post. I will take the post. Thank you. You do not need to thank me. The terms are fair. The work is honest. You require a manager, and I require employment. We are well met. I will be here at 8 tomorrow morning, if that suits you. It suits me. I will be here at 8 as well. Your Grace, may I ask you one question? You may ask me any question. Why the whole stable? He stood for a moment under the arch, with the bright cobbles behind him and the dim sweep of the tack passage ahead of him, and he looked at her without any change of expression, and answered without any hesitation at all, because half a stable was not enough to make the point. Because Lord Carroway is a man who measures the seriousness of a correction in pounds sterling and in number of horses, and I wished to be perfectly understood. Because... He paused, and his voice altered for the first time, very slightly, into something gentler. Because the bay mare was your father's pride, and a whole stable was the least I could offer for what you had lost in offering her. I did not, when I offered it, know that it was for what you had lost. I knew it afterward. I would offer it again. Thank you, Your Grace. 8 tomorrow. 8. She walked back to the grey gelding. The groom held the head. She mounted. She turned the gelding in the cobbled court, and she rode out under the arch with the groom behind her, and she did not look back at the stable, because she had work to do at the stable, beginning at 8 the following morning, and she would have years, perhaps, to look at it. She came home at 5 o'clock. She walked into the cottage and laid her gloves on the writing table next to the brass currycomb. The post is mine, she said. Good, said Mrs. Whitfield. She did not turn from the bread she was kneading. She did not say anything else. That night, Clara wrote, in her own hand, by the light of a single tallow, a letter of acceptance, which she sealed with her father's old seal, a winged horse, very worn, and she set the letter on the dresser under the salt cellar to go up to Ravensmere with the early carter, and she went to bed, and she slept clean through to the morning bell, without dreaming once, which she had not done in 6 months. By the morning of the 2nd day at Ravensmere, the news was through the county. By the morning of the 4th day, it was in the country papers as far north as Reading. By the morning of the 7th day, the lower drawing-room at Carroway Place, 12 miles east of Ravensmere, on the chalk ridge above the River Test, was full of 3 calling neighbours, 2 cousins, and the Dowager Marchioness of Caswell, who had ridden over in her landau without sending word, and who had not removed her gloves. My dear Edmund, said the Dowager, who had been Augusta Lacey before her marriage, and was now 63, and very upright in claret-coloured silk. You have made me ride 12 miles before luncheon. Madam, I am sorry for it. You are not. Sit down. Pour me a glass of the sherry that does not taste of the dust of your cellar. Tell me what has happened at Wickham. Edmund Carroway poured the sherry. He sat. He smiled the small, narrow smile that the Dowager had known since he was 19, and had been able to read like a printed bill. Ravensmere has set up a country girl as the manager of his stable, madam. He has done a great deal more than set up a manager. He has paid the price of a stable for a single mare in your face. The story is in 3 counties this morning. I had it from my niece in Andover yesterday, and from my apothecary in Petersfield this morning. The story is not that he has set up a manager. The story is that he has corrected Edmund Carraway in the public ring at Wickham. The story is that he has done it on behalf of a girl whose name he should not, by any reasonable expectation, have known. The story is, therefore, that he intends to marry her. The story is going to keep being that, Edmund, until either he marries someone else, or she leaves the parish. Which of those 2 outcomes are we going to arrange? Madam, Edmund. My patience with you on the question of marriage is finite, and I have spent the last 3 years of it. You were intended for my Honoria when she was 12 and you were 14. The estates run alongside each other. The investment in the chalk bits depends on your joint signature. I had thought we might lose Ravensmere to the Bath cousins when Henry was taken, and we very nearly did. Now we have him on our chalk and breathing our air, and his eye is to be on a Whitfield. We cannot have this. Honoria will be 26 in November. Honoria will not wait. Honoria is here in the carriage. Send for her. Honoria Lacey came in from the carriage, tall, fair, pale, in ivory satin under a cherry-bruised pelisse, still the most beautiful unmarried woman in the county, and aware of it. She bowed to Edmund. She sat at her mother's elbow. She did not speak. "Now," said the dowager. "The plan, Edmund." "Madam, the Duke will be at the November meet at the Petersfield Kennels in 8 weeks. He cannot honourably refuse. His cousin was master of the hunt for 15 years. He will be lodged at the Crown for 2 nights. The hunt ball is at the Assembly Rooms on the 2nd night. You will receive a card from the stewards by Friday. You will accept. You will bring Honoria. I will arrange the rest. You will speak to him at the ball. You will be charming. You will offer the dance. I will speak to him afterwards on the question of the chalk pit signature, and the question of the engagement. The engagement, madam, will be drawn from a document I have under glass in my study, which the late Duke signed at Christmas 3 years ago, and which we have not had occasion to act upon since." "You have," said Honoria in a clear, cold voice, "an engagement under glass." "I have. You did not show it to me. I did not need to. I am showing it to you now. I am showing it to you because the new Duke must marry by Easter, or your mother will have wasted 12 years of her life, and I will not have your mother wasting 12 years of her life on my account. The Duke will receive the document at the ball. He will be invited to acknowledge it. He will acknowledge it, because the alternative is to dishonour his cousin's signature. He will be obliged to acknowledge that the engagement existed, and that it remains his to honour. You will then have 10 weeks to make him pleased to do so." "And the Whitfield girl?" "The Whitfield girl is a manager of his stable. She will be a manager of his stable when you marry him. She will be paid 80 guineas a year. She will rise to 100. She will continue to mend his horses. We do not propose to disturb her in her work. We propose only to ensure that her work does not become her position." Honoria was silent. Edmund refilled the sherry. "Madam," he said, "you have my admiration. I have your participation, Edmund. That is what I came for. The participation costs me the chalk pit signature in my own name on the day of the ball. Are we agreed?" "We are agreed." "Good. We do not speak of this matter at Ravensmere. We do not speak of it at the Crown. We do not speak of it before the ball. The Duke must come to the ball expecting nothing. The Duke must be allowed to think that the matter at Wickham was a small thing, and is forgotten." "And the Whitfield girl, madam? Truly? She is to be left alone?" "She is to be left alone by us. She is not, of course, to be left alone by you. You have already begun to harass her. I do not propose to instruct you in that work. You are tolerably competent in it. I propose only that the harassment continue at a pitch which produces a satisfactory effect on the Duke's nerves, without producing any public sympathy for the girl. Do you take my meaning?" "I take your meaning, madam." "Then we have done." The dowager set her glass on the table and rose. Honoria rose. The dowager held out her hand for her gloves. Honoria handed them. The dowager pulled them on, smoothed the buttons, and crossed to the long sash window that gave onto the south lawn of Caraway Place. She stood at the window for a long moment with her gloved hand on the catch.
Edmund, one thing more.
Madam. The girl rides up to Ravensmere every morning at 8. She rides home at 5. She does it alone since the second week. I have made my inquiries. The chalk lane between Burcombe and the South Down is empty between 4 and 6 in the evening of every day except market day. Madam, I'm not asking you to do anything to the girl. I'm asking you to ensure that the Duke knows the lane is not safe. I'm asking you to ensure that he knows it because she has had an unpleasant ride home. The unpleasantness need not exceed a horse refusing a hedge because someone has stood at the head of the hedge with a hat. Do you take my meaning? Madam, I take your meaning. Good. The hunt ball is the 2nd of November. We have 6 weeks. She left the room. Honoria left after her. Edmund poured himself a second glass of sherry and drank it in 2 swallows. Edmund Caraway sat down in the wing chair under his cousin's portrait and put his hand briefly across his eyes. And the gesture was the gesture of a man who is being driven, not of a man who is driving. And there was no one in the lower drawing room of Caraway Place to see it. Then he straightened. He set the glass down. He rang the bell. "Send for Mr. Pell," he said. "I require a horse and a hat for tomorrow afternoon." 3 weeks later, Clara Whitfield had been at Ravensmere every weekday from 8 to 5, and she had begun to know the stable as one knows the rooms of a house one has grown up in. She had cleared 2 empty boxes and ordered fresh bedding. She had agreed terms with Mr. Henley of Salisbury for 2 brood mares to come up in October. She had dismissed the undergroom who had been pocketing the hoof oil allowance. She had kept old Tom Norris, 38 years at Ravensmere, not spoken to civilly by anyone since the morning the 4th Duke had been laid in the chapel, and had made him her ally in 3 days by asking his advice in front of the Duke and acting on it without amendment. The steady grey gelding the Duke had set aside for her use was named Caesar by her younger sister Sophie on a Saturday visit, and the name had stuck. Adam was at the stable every morning before Clara arrived. He was at the stable through most of every day. He rode out with her, sometimes, when she went over the home pastures to look at the sheep his cousin's bailiff had allowed to overgraze the bottom of the south paddock. He stood at her shoulder when she examined a yearling. He asked her questions in a low voice and listened to her answers without interrupting them, and put the answers into a small black tally book of his own, which Clara had not been shown the inside of, and had not asked to be shown. He was, she discovered, easy to work with. He did not contradict her. He did not flatter her. He did not stand too close. He did, on the 3rd morning of the 2nd week, lend her his own folded handkerchief when the brown gelding's poultice had cracked open under her finger and she had pricked herself on the wire of the suspensory wrap. And she had taken the handkerchief with a nod and returned it laundered 2 days later, folded in a small square of brown paper with no note attached, and he had pocketed it without remark. By the morning of the 1st day of October, the Ravensmere stable was a different stable. By the afternoon of the 1st day of October, Clara found, in the stall of the brown gelding, on the floor between the manger and the wall, a stranger's hat. The hat was a grey beaver, low-crowned, with a black band. It was new. The brim had not yet been creased by use. It had no maker's mark inside it. Clara picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. She walked it out into the cobbled court and laid it on the window ledge under the clock, and went to find Tom Norris. "Tom, whose is the hat in the brown gelding's box?" "That is not my hat, miss." "I see that. Whose is it?" "It is not Mr. Hollis's hat. Mr. Hollis was at the Wednesday market and is not back. It is not Jem's hat. Jem has no money for a hat like that. It is not His Grace's. His Grace has not been into the stable this afternoon. His Grace is at the South Lodge with the surveyor." "Then whose is it, Tom?" "It is not anyone's hat that I know of, miss." "Tom, has any stranger come into the court this afternoon?" Tom Norris went very still. He looked, briefly, at the cobbles. There was a man at the arch at 2 o'clock, miss. He said he had come up with a message from Mr. Hollis, from Mr. Bunce of Wickham. I told him Mr. Hollis was at market. He said he would step into the harness room and write the message and leave it. I let him in. He was in the harness room maybe 5 minutes. He came out. He had no message. He said he would write it that evening and send it. He bowed and went out under the arch. I did not see him again. What did he look like, Tom? He was a thin man, miss. Fair hair. He was a gentleman, in his speech and in his coat. Did he go anywhere near the brown geldings box? Miss, he could have done. I was at the pump and I had my back to the boxes for 2 minutes. I did not see him at the box. I will not say he was not at the box. I am sorry, miss. Tom, do not be sorry. Send Jem to the South Lodge. I would like his grace to see the hat. She sat down on the bench by the harness room door with the grey beaver on her lap. She did not touch the inside of it. She waited. The afternoon shadow lengthened across the cobbles. The pump clicked. The brown gelding, in his box, stamped twice and was still. After a quarter of an hour, Adam came across the cobbles with his surveyor's roll under his arm and his shirt sleeves up and his coat over his shoulder. And he saw the hat on Clara's lap, and he set the roll down on the window ledge under the clock, and he came over without speaking and stood in front of her, and she handed in the hat. He took it. He turned it over. He examined the band. He examined the lining. He held it up to the light. This is new from Locke's, he said. St. James's. It was bought within the month. Yes. Lord Carraway has an account at Locke's. So do 6 other gentlemen of this county. None of the 6 others has any business in my stable. Tom Norris admitted a man this afternoon who claimed a message for Mr. Hollis. The man went into the harness room for 5 minutes. Tom did not see him at the brown geldings box. He cannot swear he was not at the box. I found the hat between the manger and the wall. He has, said Adam, very mild, lost his hat. He has. He has lost his hat in the box of the lame brown gelding. He has not lost it in the box of the bay mare. He has not lost it in the harness room, where he was. He has not lost it in the tack room. He has lost it in the only box in the line where the door does not latch firmly. I had meant to have the latch mended this week. He has lost it after leaning in to lay something in the manger. What is in the manger? Miss Whitfield. I have not looked, Your Grace. Let us look. They walked to the brown gelding's box. Adam opened the lower half of the door. He stepped in. He laid his hand on the brown gelding's shoulder, and the brown gelding leaned his head against the offered shoulder, in the small, grateful way of a horse who has been confused by his afternoon. And Adam ran the back of his hand under the rim of the manger, and brought out a small twist of brown paper. He set the paper on the door ledge. He unfolded it. Inside the paper was a thumb's pinch of dried laurel. Not enough to harm the brown gelding badly. The brown gelding was off his feed in any case, and 1 pinch of laurel in mash would have caused a colic, not anything worse, and the colic would have been put down to the suspensory. Enough, however, to lose the horse for a fortnight. Enough to set the stable back. Enough, perhaps, to confirm Lord Carraway's old story that the Ravensmere stable was not worth managing, and that the new manager was not worth her wage. Clara looked at the laurel. She did not say anything. Adam folded the paper. He put the paper into the inner pocket of his coat. He stood with his hand on the brown gelding's shoulder for a long moment, and his face went very still, in a way Clara had not yet seen, and the slate-grey eyes were very cold and very flat. And Clara saw, perfectly clearly for 1 second, the cavalry officer who had been at Salamanca in 1812. Miss Whitfield. Your Grace. I am going to ride to Carraway Place tomorrow morning at 9. Your Grace. I am going to ride to Carraway Place tomorrow morning at 9, and I am going to return Lord Carraway his hat, and I am going to inform him that the next twist of laurel in any manger in this stable will be answered by an action under common law for criminal trespass, and an action under the Black Act for malicious injury to a working horse. and I am going to be very careful, in informing him of this, not to lose my temper. Will you ride with me? To Caraway Place? To Caraway Place. Your Grace, no. 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 He will use my presence against you. He will say you have brought your manager to his door. He will say things at the door of Caraway Place which the servants of Caraway Place will repeat in 3 counties by the end of the week, and which you will not be able to answer, because you cannot, with dignity, answer them at his door. You will ride alone. You will be perfectly civil. You will return the hat. You will say what you said you would say. You will leave. I will be at the stable when you come back. I will tell you what I think when you have told me what was said. He looked at her for a moment. You are very practical, Miss Whitfield. I am very practical, Your Grace. 8 tomorrow morning, then, as usual. 8. He turned from the brown gelding's box. He paused. He looked back at her, briefly, with the slate-grey eyes a degree less cold than they had been a minute earlier, and the dry corner of his mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but very nearly was one. Miss Whitfield. Your Grace. It is, in fact, possible that I will lose my temper. May I ask you, in your professional capacity as the manager of my stable, not to draw any conclusions about my character from what I may say to Lord Caraway in the next 24 hours. Your Grace, I will reserve my conclusions. Thank you. She finished the brown gelding's poultice. She rinsed her hands at the pump. She turned out the lamp in the harness room and walked down to the home paddock and brought the grey gelding's Caesar up to the mounting block and mounted. And she rode home along the chalk lane between Burcombe and Lower Tare in the long, red October light. And she watched every hedge and every gateway and every blind corner with the deliberate, steady attention of a woman who has been told, without being told, that the lane is not entirely safe. Nothing happened in the lane that evening. Nothing happened in the lane on the following Monday, or Tuesday, or Wednesday. And the Duke returned from Caraway Place on the Friday morning of the 2nd week of October, as steady as he had left. And he reported to Clara in 3 sentences that Caraway had received him in the breakfast room, had accepted the hat without speaking, had listened to the speech in perfect silence, had bowed at the end of it, and had said only, Your Grace, a very interesting morning call, before ringing the bell for his man to show the Duke out. That is, said Clara, approximately the answer of a man who has not been frightened. It is. He will try again. He will. We must be more careful with strangers in the court. Yes. But on the Tuesday of the 3rd week of October, when Clara rode home in a great wet wind out of the southwest, under a low, broken sky, the lane was not safe. She had ridden the grey gelding Caesar out of the Ravensmere Drive at 20 minutes past 5. The sky had been thickening since 3. By the time she came up to the chalk lane turning at the foot of the south, down the wind was running in steady cold sheets against the gelding's right shoulder, and the first heavy drops were striking the dust of the lane in small, dark stars. She put her head down. She drew the cape of her father's old habit forward over her shoulders. She let the gelding go on at a walk. The chalk lane between Burcombe and Lower Tare was a sunk lane between high hazel banks, and the banks gave shelter from the wind, but caught and held the rain. And within 10 minutes, Clara's gloves were wet through, and the gelding's mane was hung in dark streaks of wet over the cropped grey neck. At the elbow of the lane, where the bank rose highest, a hawthorn limb came over the path low. There had been no hawthorn limb across the path that morning. Clara saw it in time. She drew up the gelding hard. The gelding stopped. Behind the hawthorn, in the gloom of the hedge, a man's outline shifted. "Move it!" said Clara, perfectly clear, to whoever was behind the hedge. The hawthorn limb did not move. The gelding put his ears back. He took half a pace sideways. Clara felt the muscle of his shoulder tighten under her knee. She turned him on the spot. The lane was narrow, but the gelding was a country horse who had been turned on narrower paths in worse light. She set him at the bank. The bank was 4 feet high, and the hazel grew thick at the crown. But a man had cut the hazel at one point in the last week for a steak. Clara saw the cut. She set the gelding at the cut. He went up the bank in 3 strong, scrambling strides. They were over the bank and into the wet stubble of the field above, and Clara turned the gelding's head southwest across the stubble, and she gave him his head, and they cantered across 1/2 a mile of wet stubble in the rain to the gate of the Lower Tare Wood. And from the gate of the Lower Tare Wood, she came home along the upper bridle path with the rain in her face the last 2 miles. She came into the cottage at 6:30. She did not say anything to her mother at first. She rubbed the grey gelding dry in the lean-to herself before she let the cottage boy take him. She came into the kitchen with her hair in dark, wet streaks against her cheek, and the indigo wool of her habit dark to the knee, and her gloves still wet. "Clara," said Mrs. Whitfield. There was a man in the chalk lane at the elbow above Burkham. He had set a hawthorn limb across the path. I went over the bank and through the stubble. Caesar is sound. I am sound. I am wet. I will write a note to his grace this evening. Clara, sit, by the fire. Take that wet. In a moment, Mamma. She wrote the note at the writing table by the east window with the brass currycomb at her elbow, and she sealed it with her father's old seal, and she gave it to the cottage boy, who took the spaniel down to the Wickham Road every evening for the night cart, and the cottage boy had it at Ravensmere stable by 8 o'clock. And at 8:20, Adam was on a horse, and at 9:30 he was at the cottage door. Mrs. Whitfield. Your Grace. Miss Whitfield. Your Grace, I am dry now. You are very pale. May I come in? You may. The drawing room. I am sorry. Mamma, will you— Stay, Clara. Stay sitting. I will bring the tea. He did not sit. He stood at the writing table by the east window with the brass currycomb under his hand and listened to Clara's account of the chalk lane and the hawthorn limb without interrupting once. And when she had finished, he stood for a moment looking at the brass of the currycomb, and then he laid his hand on it briefly, and then he removed his hand and looked up. Miss Whitfield, I should not have allowed you to ride home alone after the laurel in the manger. The fault is mine. From tomorrow morning, Tom Norris will ride down with you in the afternoon. I will not, by way of decency, ride down with you myself, but Tom will. You will not refuse him. I will not refuse him. Thank you. I will speak to Mr. Bunce in the morning, and we will lay an information for trespass before the magistrate at Wickham by the end of the week. I will speak to my own solicitor about the wider question. I will be at Caraway Place again the morning after the information is laid. Your Grace. Miss Whitfield. Do not go alone. I will take my solicitor. Thank you. He looked at her then, for the first time, without the careful 4 feet of professional distance he had kept in the cobbled court for 3 weeks. He looked at her with the slate-grey eyes very plain and very direct from across the small drawing-room of Whitfield Cottage, and Clara, sitting in the wing-chair by the cold grate, with her hair in damp tendrils against her cheek, and the indigo habit drying on her in the heat of the kitchen fire, felt, very precisely, the moment her own composure ceased to be a thing she was producing on purpose, and became a thing she was producing against herself. And she folded her hands in her lap, and lowered her eyes to the brass of the currycomb on the writing table by his hand, and the currycomb was very warm in the lamplight, and the lamplight was very gold, and she made her voice as level as she could. Your Grace, you have ridden a long way in a wet evening. The kitchen is warm. My mother will give you a glass of something before you ride back. I would be glad if you stayed 1/2 an hour by the kitchen fire before you go. He looked at her another moment. 1/2 an hour, he said. Thank you. He stayed 1/2 an hour. He sat at the kitchen table in his wet coat across the corner from Mrs. Whitfield, drank a glass of elderflower cordial, and ate brown bread with the late blackberry jam. He asked Mrs. Whitfield 3 quiet questions about the orchard. Sophie came down the stair in her nightgown, saw the Duke at the kitchen table, and stopped on the bottom step, very wide-eyed. Your Grace, I am sorry, I did not know you were in the kitchen. The Duke rose from the table and bowed to Sophie as gravely as he had bowed to Mrs. Whitfield 2 weeks before, and Sophie curtsied with her hand at her plait. Clara, watching from the doorway, felt the small, unpermitted shift of a hinge somewhere inside her that she had spent 3 weeks not noticing. He rode home at 10 o'clock, under a sky that had cleared. The cottage was very quiet after he had gone. Clara went up to her room. She undressed by candle. She braided her hair. She lay down. She did not sleep until 2. The following morning at 8, Tom Norris was at the cottage gate with his cob, and Clara rode up with him. The morning after that, they rode up together, and the morning after that. Tom rode down with her in the afternoons. The chalk lane was watched. The information was laid before the magistrate at Wickham on the Friday. The Duke went to Carraway Place on the Monday with his solicitor. Carraway received them in the breakfast room again. Carraway listened. Carraway said, "Your Grace, your solicitor and I will correspond." The Duke bowed. He left. He rode home. But the laurel did not appear again, and the chalk lane stayed empty. And through the long, bright, cold last week of October, the Ravensmere stable went on quietly being mended. 2 of the empty boxes were filled, with Mr. Henley's mares arrived from Salisbury. The brown geldings' suspensory began to set, and in the cobbled court at Ravensmere stable, between the harness room and the brown geldings' box, between 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening on every weekday of the last week of October, Clara Whitfield and the 5th Duke of Ravensmere worked side by side in a careful, steady silence, and neither of them said anything to the other that was not on the subject of horses, and both of them stood, more and more often, half a foot closer to each other than the work strictly required. On the 2nd of November, the post brought a card to Ravensmere Park for the hunt ball at Petersfield, and on the 4th, a card to Carraway Place, and on the 6th, a card to Whitfield Cottage. For the manager of the Ravensmere stable, signed at the bottom in the Duke's own hand, with the request that Miss Whitfield should accept it as part of her professional duties, the Duke having undertaken to escort her himself. Mrs. Whitfield set the card on the dresser under the salt cellar. "Clara, Mama, you will go. I will go. You have nothing to wear. I have my mother's gown. You will not wear my gown. My gown is 26 years old. You will wear what I am going to write to your Aunt Lavinia this morning to send down from Bath. Mama, I will not have you write to Aunt Lavinia. You will not stop me, Clara, because the gown that comes down from Bath is the gown my sister bought for the occasion of my engagement to your father in 1789, and has been kept in tissue in her press at Camden Place ever since. And the gown is ruby silk. And you will be the only woman at the Petersfield ball in ruby silk. And you will not be ashamed. Mama, you will not be ashamed, Clara. No, Mama. Good. The gown will be here by Thursday. The gown was there by Thursday. The ball was a fortnight away. The Ravensmere stable went on being mended in the bright, cold mornings of November. The Duke rode out at dawn with Clara on the grey gelding and a brace of the Salisbury mares in halter behind, and they went over the home pastures in the white frost, and the breath of the horses stood out on the air, and Clara felt, more clearly with each frosted morning, that she was riding towards something she had not yet been given permission to name, and that the not naming of it was costing her, by the 2nd week of November, very nearly more than she could afford. On the Tuesday of the 2nd week of November, the broodmare from Salisbury, the elder of the two, an iron grey called Maple, went into the early stages of foaling 4 days before her time. Clara was at the box at 3 in the afternoon. She had been there since 2. Mr. Henley had warned her, in his last letter, that Maple had had a hard foaling the spring before, and would want quiet hands. Clara had sent Jem for the Duke when the first signs came. The Duke was on the South Down with the bailiff. Tom Norris was at the Wickham Forge. The undergrooms were in the home paddock with the brown gelding. There was, for the better part of an hour, no one in the cobbled court but Clara and the iron grey mare. And the iron grey mare went down at 3:20, and could not get her hind feet under her, and the foal was the wrong way around in the canal, and Clara took off her habit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of her underblouse and went into the straw on her knees and did what her father had taught her to do in the spring she had been 17. She was elbow deep and very calm when Adam came in under the arch. He came at a run from the home pasture. Jem had found him, and he came across the cobbles in 3 strides and into the box without speaking, and saw what Clara was doing, and dropped to his own knees in the straw without taking off his coat, and laid his big hands on the mare's flank in the place Clara would have asked him to lay them if she had had the breath to speak.
"Hold her there," said Clara. "Yes." "Speak to her." "Yes." "Easy now, my dear, easy. The good girl, easy now." His voice was low and quiet at the mare's ear, the cavalry voice of a man who had quieted 100 horses, and the iron-grey mare's flank shuddered and steadied under his hand. And Clara felt, between her own forearm and the mare's body, the foal's hind feet come round, and she set her shoulder against the straw and turned. "Now!" The Duke held. The mare pushed. The foal came round. Clara took the foal's hind legs in both hands. The next contraction brought the foal half clear. The next brought the foal fully clear. Clara cleared the membrane from the foal's nose with the corner of her underblouse and laid the foal in the straw at the mare's flank. And the foal sneezed once and breathed, and the iron-grey mare lifted her head and looked, and the Duke set his hand once, briefly, on the mare's wet neck. "There you are, my dear," he said to the mare. "There you are." Clara sat back in the straw. She was breathing hard. Her underblouse was soaped at the front. Her arms to the elbow were dark to the elbow with birth water. Her hair had come down out of its knot at some point in the last 40 minutes and was hanging in a heavy auburn rope across her shoulder. She was, in this moment, with the iron-grey mare licking the wet foal under her hands, and the slate-grey eyes of the Duke very level across the straw at her, the most clearly beautiful she had been in 26 years of her life. And the Duke saw it, and he did not move. He did not move. He sat back on his heels at the mare's other flank, with his coat ruined and his shirt-sleeves wet to the elbow, and his hands open at his knees, and he looked at her across the straw with the slate-grey eyes very steady and very plain. And his face did the thing she had been watching the corner of for 6 weeks, went perfectly still all over, in a way that was not the cavalry stillness, but a different stillness, a stillness that had nothing to do with command. And after a long moment, he made his voice mild. "Miss Whitfield." "Your Grace?" "You are very capable." "Thank you, Your Grace." "I am, I find, breathing somewhat hard." "It was a great deal of work, Your Grace." "It was the foaling that I refer to. The foaling, primarily." The dry corner of his mouth did the small thing it did. Clara looked down at the iron-grey mare and the wet foal, and the small, startled half-smile that came up onto her face was a smile she had not given to a man in 3 years. And she did not raise her eyes to him while it was on her face, because she did not want him to see it. She felt him see it anyway. She felt the slate-grey eyes on the side of her cheek as plainly as if he had reached his hand across the straw, and she did not look up. "What shall we call her, Your Grace?" "Her?" "It is a filly." "It is a filly." He paused. He looked at the wet, small, dark shape in the straw. He said, in his quiet voice, without any humor now, "I had thought, if it pleased you, we might call her Promise." Clara felt the brass of the currycomb in the pocket of her habit jacket on the hook on the back of the box door. She had hung the jacket there at 2:05, and she felt the weight of her own hair against her shoulder, and the warmth of the iron-grey mare's flank against her knee. And she heard her own voice come out at the perfect level it always came out at, and she answered him. "Promise. Yes. That is a good name, Your Grace." "Good." He rose. He went to the door of the box and called for Jem and Tom Norris, who had come back from the forge in the last 5 minutes,
and was standing at the harness room doorway with his cap in his hand. And the men came in and took the foal at the mare's head, and brought hot water and clean towels and a fresh bed of straw, and Clara washed her arms at the pump in the cobbled court, with the Duke standing 4 feet off holding the towel for her. And neither of them said anything to each other for the quarter of an hour it took to wash and dry and put her habit jacket back on. And the silence between them was no longer the careful silence of the last 6 weeks. At 5:45, Clara rode home with Tom Norris under a low, pink November sky. She came into the cottage at 6:20. She told her mother that the foaling had gone well, and the filly was named Promise, and that she would go up to Ravensmere in the morning to see how the mare did, and her mother set the supper on the table and watched her over the candles, and did not ask her what had happened in the cobbled court at the pump. And Clara, eating her bread and her mutton broth with both hands very steady on the spoon, was perfectly grateful to her mother for not asking. At 9 o'clock she went up to her room. She unbraided her hair. She brushed it. She looked at her own face in the small glass on her dressing chest by the light of a single candle. She did not, in that moment, know what to do. She knew, by the 2nd of November, that she was in love with the Duke of Ravensmere. She knew, too, that she had promised her mother on the day she had met him that she would not let herself believe what she was not entitled to believe, and that in 8 weeks of working at her elbow, the Duke had not said one word or made one gesture that gave her permission. The hunt ball at Petersfield was 4 days off. The ruby silk gown that had once been her Aunt Lavinia's was hanging in tissue in the press at the foot of her bed. The Dowager Marchioness of Caswell and her daughter, Lady Honoria Lacey, would be at the ball, and so would she, Clara Whitfield, manager of the Ravensmere stable. Whatever happened there would happen in front of the whole of the country. She blew the candle out. She lay down. She did not sleep until 3. On the second night of the November meet, at 8:30, the assembly rooms at Petersfield were full. The room was long, with 3 chandeliers and country garlands of dried hop and late hothouse roses. The floor was chalked. The musicians were in the small gallery above the door. The country gentlemen of 3 parishes were in their best coats, the ladies in their best gowns, and along the south wall the older women had ranged themselves on the gold-painted benches, with their fans in their gloved hands and their eyes on the door. The Dowager Marchioness of Caswell was on the central bench, in claret silk with the family pearls at her throat. Lady Honoria Lacey stood at her mother's right hand in ivory satin, with a single line of small white pearls along the high waist of the gown. Lord Edmund Carraway stood at the Dowager's left, in a black coat and a white waistcoat, with his fair hair brushed forward at the brow in the new fashion. The 5th Duke of Ravensmere came into the room at 9:20, with Clara Whitfield on his arm. The room hushed. It hushed in the unconsidered way of a country assembly that has been waiting 6 weeks for one moment of theatre, and has been given 2. The Duke was in his evening blacks, with no jewellery and no orders, and only the late Duke's plain gold signet on the smallest finger of his right hand. He was perfectly steady. He did not look at the central bench. He looked briefly at the musicians and inclined his head, and the musicians played out the last bar of the set they had been finishing without him noticing them at all. Clara was in the ruby silk. The gown had been bought in Bath in 1789 by Lavinia Pelham for her sister Anne Whitfield's engagement, and it had been pressed and let down and let out by Mrs. Whitfield's own hand in the 4 days since it had come down from Camden Place, and it fitted Clara as if it had been made for her in the last month. The colour was the deep, cool ruby of the December rose. The silk had the soft, heavy weight of 40 years of careful tissue paper, and against it, Clara's auburn hair, knotted at the nape, smooth, plain, with one single dropped curl at the temple, and her clear, pale country skin and her grey-green eyes were the only ornaments the gown required. She wore no jewellery. She had borrowed nothing. She walked into the assembly rooms at the Duke's elbow, with her chin lifted at exactly the angle her father had taught her to lift it at the parish rent day, and the crowd along the rail of the dance floor parted for her, and the older women on the gold benches set their fans down in their laps, and the Dowager Marchioness of Caswell did not, for one count of 10, breathe. "Madam," said Adam to the Dowager, as they came up the side of the room, "may I present Miss Whitfield, who is the manager of my stable?" "Your Grace," said the Dowager. "Miss Whitfield," said Lady Honoria, with the smallest possible inclination of her ivory head. "Lady Honoria," said Clara, with the smallest possible inclination of her ruby one. "Lord Carroway," said Adam. "Your Grace." "I should be very pleased to dance the first set with Miss Whitfield," said Adam, looking at no one in particular, "and the supper set with Lady Honoria, if Lady Honoria will permit it, and the third with whoever Lord Carroway should be so good as to introduce me to." There was no possible refusal. The Dowager bowed. Lady Honoria bowed. Lord Carroway bowed. The musicians began the first set. Adam offered Clara his arm. Clara took it. They walked the length of the room to the head of the line. The crowd watched them go. She remembered the figures. She moved through them with the calm of a woman who has remembered her father in the doing of them, and Adam, who had been a cavalry officer for 9 years and a duke for 7 months, and had not danced in either capacity since 1812, danced the figures very correctly and at the right pace, and made no error, and did not say anything to her in the down the line, until, at the bottom of the line, at the moment the two of them stood at the foot of the figure together, waiting for the turn at the top. He spoke for the first time, very low, at her ear, looking out across the room, and not at her. "Miss Whitfield, I have a thing to say to you, which I will not say in this room. May I call at the cottage tomorrow morning?" "Yes, Your Grace." 10 o'clock. 10. "Thank you." The turn came. They went up the line. The first set ended. He bowed to her at the head of the line. She curtsied to him. He led her back along the side of the room, toward the Dowager Marchioness of Caswell. And the Dowager Marchioness did not rise from the central bench, and the supper set was called, and Adam offered his hand to Lady Honoria, and Lady Honoria gave him hers. And Clara stood at the edge of the floor, between Lord Carroway and a cousin of the Dowager's whose name she did not know, and she watched the Duke lead Lady Honoria onto the floor for the supper set, and her face did not move. It was at the close of the supper set that the Dowager Marchioness of Caswell did what she had ridden 12 miles 6 weeks before to arrange the doing of. She rose from the central bench. She crossed the floor, with Honoria at her elbow, to the alcove off the long room where the supper had been laid on 3 trestle tables under the chandelier. The Duke had handed Honoria into the alcove and bowed, and was turning to fetch a glass of something for her, when the Dowager met him in the center of the alcove, and a footman behind her carried, on a silver salver, a single folded document under a single seal of red wax. "Your Grace, I would be glad of a word." "Madam?" "Privately. The little antechamber there will do." Adam went with her into the antechamber. The antechamber gave onto the alcove by a single door, and the door was open, and from the door of the alcove, 4 people could see in. Lady Honoria, who stood at the supper table without moving, Lord Edmund Carroway, who had come up at the Dowager's signal, the cousin of the Dowager's, whose name Clara did not know, who had not moved from Clara's elbow, and Clara herself. Clara saw Adam look at the document on the salver. She saw him take the document from the salver. She saw him break the seal. She saw him read. She saw his face go perfectly still, in the way she had now learned to read. He was a long moment reading. He was a long moment after reading, without raising his eyes from the page. He set the page down on the small inlaid table by his elbow. He looked at the Dowager. "Madam." "Your Grace, I should be obliged for your acknowledgement." He did not speak for a moment. He looked at the document. He looked at the Dowager. He looked, briefly, past her shoulder through the open door of the antechamber into the alcove, and his eye found Clara's, at the far edge of the alcove, past Honoria's white shoulder and Edmund Carroway's fair head. And Clara saw, with perfect clarity, what was in his face. It was not surprise. It was not, even, dismay. It was a very level, very quiet decision. He turned back to the dowager. "Madam, my cousin's signature is on this paper. I do not deny it. I will write to you in the morning. I cannot, in this antechamber, give you the answer you have come for." "Your Grace, the acknowledgement is what I ask. The acknowledgement, not the answer." "Madam, in this country, an acknowledgement of an engagement at a hunt ball at Petersfield in front of 70 people is the answer. You are aware of this. You have arranged for it to be so. I will not give you the acknowledgement in this room. I will write to you tomorrow morning at Caswell House. You will have your reply by 10. Forgive me, I have a partner waiting at the supper table." He bowed. He did not raise his voice. He folded the document. He returned it to the salver. He walked out of the antechamber, back into the alcove, and crossed to the supper table, and handed Lady Honoria a glass of negus, and the dowager remained in the antechamber for the count of 15 before she followed. And when she came out into the alcove, her face was perfectly composed. But the document had been read. The seal had been broken in the antechamber. Lord Edmund Carroway, who had been standing where he could see into the antechamber from his angle, had been the only person in the alcove besides the Duke and the Dowager who had seen the wax break. He had not seen the words of the document. He did not need to. He had watched the Duke's face for the half-minute the Duke had been reading. He had watched Clara's face for the half-second the Duke had looked up and met her eyes. He had seen the level decision in the Duke's face. He had seen the small white line that came up at the corner of Clara's mouth and did not go away. He crossed the alcove. He came to Clara at the side of the long room. "Miss Whitfield." "Lord Carroway." "You have, I believe, been promised the third set by my cousin." "I have been promised the third set by my cousin, my lord." "Then you and I are introduced as partners by no less an authority than the Duke. Will you give me your hand for the third?" "I will give you the third, my lord." "Thank you." The third set was called. Edmund Carroway led Clara onto the floor, with his fair head bent very slightly toward hers, and the country gentlemen along the rail watched them with the small, still attention of men who had heard the story of the auction ring at Wickham. The set began. The figures of the set were the figures of a slow Hampshire reel. Clara moved through them. She did not look at Carroway, except in the figures that required it. She did not speak. At the bottom of the reel, on the third turn, Carroway spoke. "You wear a fine gown, Miss Whitfield." "Thank you, my lord." "It is, I believe, the only ruby silk in the room." "It is, my lord." "It suits you very well. It also, if you will forgive me, displays you very plainly to those of us who have known the room a long while. You stand out in it. You do not perhaps understand quite how much you stand out in it." "I understand a great deal, my lord, about how much I stand out in it." "I am sure you do. I am sure you do." They turned. They came up the line. "Miss Whitfield." "My lord." "My aunt's document, the one she has just shown the Duke in the antechamber. You will be interested to know it is an engagement of marriage between His late Grace and my cousin Honoria, drawn at Christmas 3 years ago, witnessed by Mr. Pelham of Andover and by my aunt's solicitor. The document binds the title, not the man. The 5th Duke is bound by it as plainly as the 4th was. He cannot, in honor, walk away from his cousin's signature on a settlement of his own family's name." "Lord Carroway, I am not interested in the document." "You will be. He will write to my aunt in the morning to acknowledge it. He has been a duke 7 months. He will not begin his title by breaking the word of the man who left him the title. I am telling you because you have a sister at Whitfield Cottage who is 12 and another who is 8, and a steward's wages of 80 guineas a year will not pay your mother's paper out by November. The Duke will not be able to keep you. I will. I will pay out the Whitfield debt at £1,200. You will leave the parish. I have a cousin in Kent with a house. You will not be troubled by me. The mayor returns to me. The stewardship is not, in any case, a position that survives the Duke's engagement." They turned. They came down the line. Clara did not look at him in the turn. She did not look at him at the bottom of the figure. She looked, very deliberately, at her own slipper on the chalked floor, and she counted in her head the steps of the figure she still owed him. And when the figure was done, and the music ended, she raised her eyes to him at the head of the line, and she made her voice perfectly clear and perfectly steady, and she made it carry only as far as his ear, and not 1 inch further. Lord Carroway, Miss Whitfield, you are a coward. She curtsied. She turned. She walked off the floor without looking at him again, the length of the long room, past the supper alcove where Lady Honoria stood very straight, past the central bench where the Dowager Marchioness of Caswell sat without expression, past the Duke, who had risen at the supper table and seen her face, and started forward and been stopped by the gap of 24 people between them. She walked past the Duke without meeting his eye. She walked out of the assembly rooms into the cold November night, and the steward at the door, who knew her father, brought her cloak without being asked, and a hired carriage stood at the porch, and she was in the carriage and on the road back to Whitfield Cottage at a few minutes after 10, and her hands inside her gloves were perfectly steady all the way home. The Duke was at the cottage at 10:15 the following morning, on a different horse, in the same black coat, and Clara received him in the drawing room with a brass currycomb on the writing table behind her. She had read, in the cold hours between 2 and 4, every plausible reading of the engagement document under glass. The worst reading was that the Duke had known of the engagement before he came to Wickham, that he had set up the stewardship as a kindness he could afford because he was already, in the safe drawer of the Dowager's study, bound elsewhere, that he had been so careful in the cobbled court to stand half a foot away because he had not been free to stand any closer. Clara had inhabited the worst reading for 1 full hour in the kitchen at 5 in the morning by the embers of the fire. At the end of the hour she had risen and washed her face and folded her hair into its plain country knot and put on her plain weekday muslin. At the kitchen door at 9:30 she had stood by her mother and said, "He will come at 10, Mama. I will see him alone. I have a thing to say to him." He came at 15:15. He left his horse with the boy at the gate. He came up the 3 stone steps and knocked at the cottage door with the back of his glove, twice, in the country way. "Your Grace," said Clara when she opened the door. "Please come in." "Miss Whitfield." She showed him into the drawing room. She did not offer him the wing chair. She stood at the writing table with her back to the east window, and the brass currycomb was under her left hand on the wood of the table where the morning light caught it. And the Duke stood 4 feet inside the door with his hat in his hand. "Miss Whitfield." "Your Grace." "Before you speak, I will speak. I have rehearsed it. I would prefer to say it without being interrupted. May I?" "You may." "Lord Carroway told me last night, in the 3rd set, that the Dowager's document is an engagement of marriage between the 4th Duke and Lady Honoria Lacey, drawn at Christmas 3 years ago, witnessed and sealed. He told me the document binds the title, not the man. He told me you have been bound by it since the day my cousin's letter at the Bath Gazette announced your title." She drew 1 breath. The whole clock ticked once. "He told me you would write to the Dowager this morning to acknowledge it, because you would not, as a new Duke, begin your title by breaking the word of the man who left you the title. He told me I had been a use of yours, that the kindness of the auction ring at Wickham was the kindness of a man who could afford to be kind to me, because he was already engaged. He told me you knew of the engagement on every one of the 8 weeks of our work in the cobbled court, and the half-foot of careful distance you kept was the half-foot of a man who had not been free to stand any closer." She drew another breath. "I have inhabited his reading. I have read it 3 times. I cannot tell, on the basis of what you have shown me, whether it is true. Your Grace, did you know of the engagement before you came to Wickham?" "No." "Did you know of it before last night?" "No." "When did you know of it?" "At 9:20 last night. The Dowager handed me the document in the antechamber of the supper alcove.
I broke the seal in her presence. I read it. The Christmas of 3 years ago, I was in Brussels. The signature on the page is my cousin Henry's hand. I have no reason to doubt it. The document binds the late Duke. The Dowager will claim it binds me. I believe the courts will not uphold her claim. I have not yet written to my solicitor on the question. I had not written, this morning, to the Dowager. I came here first. I came here, Miss Whitfield, because what I have to say to you cannot wait on the letter to the Dowager, and the letter to the Dowager cannot be written until I have said it to you. May I now say it? Your Grace. Yes. You have answered my question. I have not yet said what I came to say. You have not. I would like, before you say it, to ask you one further question. Ask. If the document had been an engagement you had signed yourself, at Christmas 3 years ago, in your own hand, in the assumption that you would never have the title, what would you have said to me in this room this morning? He was silent a long moment. He did not look away from her. The morning light from the east window was very clear on his face. The scar under the cheekbone was a thin, pale line. I would have said it to you anyway. I would have said I had been wrong 3 years ago, and I would correct it now at whatever cost I was required to pay. I would have ridden from this drawing room to Caswell House and dissolved the engagement on my own terms before I came back. I would have come back. The cost is not the question. The question, only, is whether the answer in this drawing room is the answer you would give me. The cost is mine to pay, either way. Then say what you came to say. Miss Whitfield. Yes. I love you. Yes. I have loved you since the 2nd week of October. I will love you to the end of my life. I will pay any cost the Dowager is in a position to charge me for the dissolution of my cousin's signature. I will pay it this morning. I am not asking, in this drawing room, for an answer. I am asking only the right to come back to this drawing room when the cost has been paid, and to ask the question then. May I have the right? You have the right, Your Grace. Thank you. He bowed. He did not move closer than the 4 feet inside the door. He turned. He went out of the drawing room into the small hall. He stopped at the cottage door. He looked back at her once over his shoulder, and the slate-grey eyes were very level. Miss Whitfield. Your Grace. You will, by tonight, hear 3 accounts of what happened in this drawing room this morning. The Caraway servants will give the first. The Dowager's solicitor will give the second. My own man of business will give the third. None of the 3 will be true. The true account is between you and me. You are not, this morning, obliged to anyone, least of all to me. Whatever you hear, the true account is what was said in this room. I will remember it, Your Grace. Thank you. He went out. The cottage door closed. Clara stood at the writing table by the east window, with her left hand on the brass of the currycomb, and she did not move for a long minute. And then she set her hand off the currycomb, and crossed to the wing chair by the cold grate, and sat down in it, and she put her hands flat in her lap, and the hall clock struck 11, and she sat in the wing chair for the count of 100 without moving, and she was perfectly steady, and she was perfectly clear, and she was, for the first time in 8 weeks, perfectly afraid. Through the open library door at Caraway Place that afternoon, at the moment the light went out of the south sash, a footman crossing the gallery above with a coal scuttle in his hand looked down through the open door and stopped a half-pace. Edmund Caraway was at his cousin's writing desk under the long sash window. On the green leather of the desktop, set square in front of him, was a miniature in a gilt frame the size of a sovereign. The miniature was of a fair-haired boy of 12 in a midshipman's collar, painted at Portsmouth in the spring of 1804. The boy had been Edmund's younger brother. His ship had been lost in a Mediterranean gale 4 months after the painting. The miniature lived ordinarily in the locked drawer at the right knee of the desk. Edmund had taken it out. He was looking at it.
His thumb moved across the painted face very slowly, in the steady, reflexive way of a thumb that had moved across the painted face many times before, in the privacy of a locked drawer. He was not aware that he was thumbing it. He did not raise his head. The footman, in the gallery above, withdrew silently along the runner and went on with his coal scuttle to the upper rooms. The south sash of the library went dark by 4:30. Edmund set the miniature back in the gilt frame and laid the frame back in the drawer, and turned the small brass key in the lock with his back to the door. And no one in Caraway Place saw him do it. It was 4 days more before Edmund Caraway came up the drive between the pollarded limes at Whitfield Cottage. In the 4 days, Adam, 5th Duke of Ravensmere, had ridden to London. He had ridden the 70 miles in 2 days, slept 4 hours, met with his solicitor at Lincoln's Inn for the whole of one morning, met with the Dowager's solicitor at the Dowager's Solicitor's Chambers in Chancery Lane for 2 hours of the afternoon, signed 3 sheets of paper, surrendered the joint Lacey-Ravensmere investment in the Caswell chalk pit, a personal loss to the Duke of £20,000 in trust-funded improvements over the next decade, which his solicitor estimated would compound to perhaps 30, and ridden back through the cold November night with the signed dissolution of the engagement under glass in his saddlebag. He had reached Ravensmere at 4 in the morning. He had slept 3 hours. He had ridden down to Whitfield Cottage at 10. He had been at the cottage 20 minutes. He had ridden back up to Ravensmere at 10:30, with Clara at his side and Tom Norris behind them, and the iron-grey mare Maple and the 4-day filly Promise turned out in the home paddock to greet the new manager, who was no longer only the manager. He had, in the 20 minutes at the cottage, asked the question. Clara had answered it. They had walked back down the gravel of the drive between the pollarded limes hand in hand, and Mrs. Whitfield had stood in the cottage doorway with both hands flat on the doorframe and her eyes very wet and her mouth in a perfectly level line, and the spaniel had gone down the drive after them and stopped at the gate and gone back, and the air had been very cold and very bright. On the afternoon of the 5th day, at 10 minutes past 3, a single horseman rode up the drive of Whitfield Cottage. The horseman was Lord Edmund Caraway. He came alone. He came without his groom and without his hat, and with a single folded leather case under his arm, in the place where a riding crop should have been. And the boy at the gate took his horse without speaking, and Edmund Caraway came up the 3 stone steps and knocked at the cottage door with the back of his glove, once, very quietly. Clara opened the door. Lord Caraway. Miss Whitfield, forgive me. I have come, if you will receive me, on a matter that will not take above 5 minutes of your time. I should be obliged. She received him in the drawing room. She did not offer him a chair. She stood at the writing table by the east window, where she had stood for the Duke. He stood 4 feet inside the door. He set the folded leather case down on the small inlaid table by his elbow. He did not open it. Miss Whitfield. Lord Caraway. I have, in this case, the title deeds to the lower 40 acres of Whitfield Field, the chalk paddock at the foot of the south, down which my late father bought from your father in 1808. I have, additionally, every loose bill of your family's that I have purchased in the last 3 months, totaling £1,173. I have the receipt for the cancellation of the same. The land returns to your family unencumbered. The bills are no longer owed by your family to me or any other person. The cancellation is irrevocable. The deeds are made out to your mother. I should be obliged if you would accept the case and read aloud 1 line of the topmost document, so that I may be assured I have not erred in the drawing of it. Clara crossed the drawing room to the small inlaid table. She did not look at Edmund Caraway. She opened the leather case. The topmost document was the deed to the 40 acres. The deed was correctly drawn in the name of Anne Whitfield, widow, of Whitfield Cottage, Wickham Parish, in the county of Hampshire. She read the topmost line aloud, in a clear, quiet voice in his hearing. To Anne Whitfield, widow of Whitfield Cottage, the lower 40 acres of Whitfield Field, freely and irrevocably of this 14th day of November, in the year of our Lord, 1815. Thank you, Miss Whitfield. You may say what you have come to say, Lord Carroway. He looked, for one long moment, at the brass of the currycomb on the writing table behind her. Then he looked back at her, and his beautiful narrow face had gone perfectly still, and his voice was perfectly his own, very quiet, without the small, obedient curve at the mouth. Miss Whitfield, I was a coward at the assembly rooms at Petersfield. I beg your pardon. It is granted, Lord Carroway. Thank you. He bowed. He turned. He left the drawing room. He took his horse from the boy at the gate. He mounted. He rode down the drive between the pollarded limes at a steady walk, without looking back, and he did not slow at the bottom of the drive, and he turned east on the chalk lane and went away in the late November sun toward Carroway Place. And Clara watched him out of sight from the east window of the drawing room, with the folded leather case in both hands, and her hands perfectly steady. Major Whitfield, 11 years before, had vouched for a fair-haired boy of 12 at the Admiralty office at Portsmouth, paying £40 for a midshipman's commission. The boy had been Edmund Carroway's younger brother. The boy's ship had been lost in a Mediterranean gale the following autumn. At the parish funeral, Major Whitfield had stood in silence beside the 19-year-old Edmund for the count of a long minute, laid one hand on the shoulder of the older brother, and gone away. Edmund had never spoken of it to a living soul. He had carried the debt for 11 years in the locked drawer at the right knee of his desk. He had bought up the Whitfield bills in the autumn to be in a position, at the right moment, to remit them. She closed the case. She walked through into the kitchen with it. Her mother was at the table with the supper bread. Mama? Yes, Clara. The 40 acres are ours again. The paper is in the case. Mrs. Whitfield set the kneading down. She wiped her hands on her apron. She came across the kitchen to her daughter. She opened the case. She read the topmost line. She closed the case. She set the case on the dresser under the salt cellar, and she sat down very carefully in the kitchen chair by the fire, and she put both hands flat on her knees, and she did not cry. But the breath she took in was the breath of a woman who has been waiting 6 months to take it. Clara. Mamma. You will marry him. I will marry him, Mamma. In April. At the parish church. The Duke has spoken to the rector. Good. Mamma. I broke my promise. I know, Clara. I did not mean to. I know that too, Clara. You are not angry. I was wrong, Clara, to ask the promise. I am sorry. I asked it of you because I was afraid for you. I should not have asked it. I should have said, Clara, be very careful, and tell me what you find. I should not have said, promise not to find anything. I am sorry, Clara. Mamma. Mrs. Whitfield rose from the kitchen chair. She crossed to her daughter. She took Clara's face in her 2 warm, flour-dusted hands, and looked into Clara's grey-green eyes the way she had looked at her on the morning of her 6th birthday at the breakfast table, very steadily and very plainly. And Clara closed her eyes for 1 second and opened them again, and her mother kissed her once on the forehead, in the manner of countrywomen who do not waste words. And then she went back to her bread and did not say anything more. The spring of the following year was very early. The blackthorn was in flower by the 2nd week of March. The mare Promise, who was by then 4 months old and the size of a large hound and already half broken to halter, followed Clara along the home pasture at Ravensmere as a dog will follow, and pushed her grey-black muzzle into Clara's pocket for the lump of brown sugar that lived there in the corner of Clara's apron, and one morning, at the end of March, nipped Tom Norris on the elbow with the small, sharp teeth of a 4-month filly. And Tom Norris laughed, in the open court, in front of the Duke and the Duke's manager, for the first time in 38 years. The wedding was on the 8th of April at Wickham Parish Church. Clara wore the ruby silk, made over once at the shoulder and once at the waist by Mrs. Whitfield's hand. She walked up the aisle on her mother's arm, her father not being there to take her arm, and her mother having said the morning of the wedding that no other arm would do, and the rector, who had buried her father 6 months before, read the service in a voice that did not falter. Adam was at the altar in a coat the colour of dark wine, and the late Duke's plain gold signet on the smallest finger of his right hand. He stood very steady. He did not, until the moment Clara reached him at the rail and her mother handed her hand over to his, allow himself the smallest smile. Then the dry corner of his mouth did the small thing it had been doing for 7 months, and Clara, looking up at him with the ruby silk catching the long bar of east light through the chancel window, returned it. They were married. They were called man and wife. They walked the length of the aisle hand in hand and out under the south porch into the bright April morning. The whole of the parish was on the green. Old Tom Norris was at the gate with his cap in his hand. Lord Edmund Carraway was not at the wedding. The Dowager Marchioness of Caswell was not at the wedding. Lady Honoria Lacey had been married 6 weeks before in London to a cousin of the Prince Regent's and was in Brighton on a 6-month tour. Mrs. Whitfield stood at the porch with Sophie and Jane on either side of her in their white spring frocks, and the spaniel sat at her foot with its tongue out, and a magpie crossed the green from the oak by the Lich Gate west toward Whitfield Cottage in a clean diagonal across the April sky. The wedding breakfast was at Ravensmere. The carriage was at the gate. That afternoon, at 5 o'clock, after the toasts, after the wedding cake, after Mrs. Whitfield had been settled in the morning room with her tea, and Sophie and Jane had been taken by old Tom Norris to see the foal Promise in her own loose box. Adam took Clara by the hand and led her out of the south door of Ravensmere, across the lawn, and around the yew hedge, and into the cobbled court of the stable, in the clear, bright April light, and they stopped together at the door of the broodmare's box. The iron-grey mare, Maple, lifted her head over the door. Behind her in the straw, the filly Promise was lying with her grey-black legs folded under her, and her grey-black tail switching once at the spring flies. Promise looked up. She came to her feet. She put her head over the door beside her mother's. She breathed once, briefly, into Adam's open hand. Clara stood at his elbow, with her hand in his. The brass currycomb was in the pocket of her grey morning gown. She had carried it with her from the cottage that morning, as she had said she would, and she had not taken it out. And she felt it warm against her hip. "Promise," said Adam to the filly, very quietly. "Promise," said the filly's mother, with her ears forward. "It is a good name," said Clara. "It is." "Your Grace." "Yes, my love." "You once gave me a whole stable for a single mare." "I did." "You did not give me too much." "I did not." "It would have been," said Clara, looking up at him in the bright April light with the small smile she had practiced on him for 7 months and could now use without rehearsal. "Approximately the correct number of horses." The dry corner of his mouth did the small thing. He bent his head. He kissed her once at the corner of the store, in the warm shadow of the broodmare's door, with the iron-grey mare's breath on his sleeve, and the filly, Promise's, grey-black muzzle pushed curiously into the back of his open coat pocket. And then he straightened, and he turned, and the two of them walked together back across the cobbled court toward the south lawn of Ravensmere, in the long gold light of the 8th of April. And the iron-grey mare put her head down to the straw of her own box, and the filly, Promise, lay down again in the straw at her mother's flank, and the clock above the stable arch struck 5.